Hello everyone, welcome to my channel TechQuest Learning Point. I hope you all are doing great. I am Bashar. In my previous tutorial in this series of Azure Fundamentals, I already discussed on the topic of Azure Features and Tools for Governance and Compliance. Today I am going to start a discussion on the topic Azure Features and Tools for Managing and Deploying Resources. In this tutorial, we will be introduced to features, tools for managing and deploying Azure resources. You will learn about the Azure portal that represent a graphic interface for managing Azure resources, command line and scripting tools that help deploy or configure resources. You will also learn about Azure services that help you manage your on-premises and multi-cloud environment from Azure. I can assure you all that this tutorial will make sense to you about Azure fundamentals. The ultimate target of this tutorial is to make you prepare for the exam AZ900 Microsoft Azure Fundamentals. If anyone want to be the Microsoft Certified Azure Fundamentals, this tutorial will be the right choice for them to make clear the exam AZ900 Microsoft Azure Fundamentals. This tutorial is derived from the Microsoft Learning Paths for Azure Fundamentals exam. So anyone can rely on this tutorial to take preparation for the exam AZ900 Azure Fundamentals. Before starting the discussion, let's look into the contents of this tutorial. What will be discussed? This tutorial will cover Azure tools and features including Azure Portal, Azure Cloud Shell like CLI and PowerShell, Azure Arc, Azure Resource Manager ARM, and Azure ARM templates that help you manage your Azure and on-premises resources. In this tutorial, Azure features and tools for managing and deploying Azure resources will be discussed elaborately. The concept about the Azure portal, which is a graphic interface for managing Azure resources, command line, and scripting tools that help deploy or configure resources, will be clear to you. You will also learn about Azure services that help you manage your on-premises and multi-cloud environment from Azure. The exam AZ900 Microsoft Azure Fundamentals includes 3 knowledge domain areas such as number 1, describe cloud concepts, number 2, describe Azure architecture and services, number 3, describe Azure management and governance. This tutorial is the 8th episode of the Azure Fundamentals series and it is part of 3 knowledge domain. In order to get the most out of Azure, you need to interact with the Azure environment, the management groups, subscriptions, resource groups, resources, and so on. Azure provides multiple tools for managing your environment, including the Azure Portal, Azure PowerShell, Azure Command Line Interface CLI. Azure Portal. The Azure Portal is a web-based unified console that provides an alternative to command line tools. With the Azure Portal, you can manage your Azure subscription by using a graphical user interface. You can build, manage, and monitor everything from simple web apps to complex cloud departments. Create custom data dashboards for an organized view of resources. Configure accessibility options for an optimal experience. Azure Cloud Shell. Azure Cloud Shell is a browser-based shell tool that allows you to create, configure, and manage Azure resources using a shell. Azure Cloud Shell support both Azure PowerShell and the Azure Command Line Interface (CLI), which is a bash shell. Azure Cloud Shell has several features that make it a unique offering to support you in managing Azure. Some of those features are: it is a browser-based shell experience with no local installation or configuration required. It's authenticated to your Azure credentials, so when you log in, it inherently knows who are and what permissions you have. You choose the shell you are most familiar with. Azure Cloud Shell supports both Azure PowerShell and the Azure CLI, which uses Bash. Azure PowerShell. Azure PowerShell is a shell with which developers, DevOps, and IT professionals can run commands and called commandlets, CMDlets. These commands call the Azure REST API to perform management tasks in Azure. CMDlets can be run independently to handle one-off changes, or they may be combined to help orchestrate complex actions such as the routine setup, tear down, and maintenance of a single resource or multiple connected resources. The deployment of an entire infrastructure, which might contain dozens or hundreds of resources from imperative code. Capturing the commands in script makes the process repeatable and automatable. In addition to be available via Azure Cloud Shell, you can install and configure Azure PowerShell on Windows, Linux, and Mac platforms. Azure CLI. Azure CLI is functionally equivalent to Azure PowerShell, with the primary difference being the syntax of commands. While Azure PowerShell uses PowerShell commands and the Azure CLI uses Bash commands. The Azure CLI provides the same benefits of handling discrete tasks or orchestrating complex operations through code. It's also installable on Windows, Linux, and Mac platforms, as well as through a Azure Cloud Shell. Due to the similarities in capabilities and access between Azure PowerShell and the Bash-based Azure CLI, it mainly comes down to which language you are most familiar with. Azure Arc. Managing hybrid and multi-cloud environments can rapidly get complicated. Azure provides a host of tools to provision, configure, and monitor Azure resources. What about on-premises resources in a hybrid configuration or the cloud resources in a multi-cloud configuration? In utilizing Azure Resource Manager (ARM), Arc lets you extend your Azure compliance and monitoring to your hybrid and multi-cloud configurations. Azure Arc simplifies governance and management by delivering a consistent multi-cloud and on-premises management platform. Azure Arc provides a centralized, unified way manage your entire environment together by projecting your existing non-Azure resources into ARM. Manage multi-cloud and hybrid virtual machines, Kubernetes, clusters, and databases as if they are running in Azure. Use familiar Azure services and management capabilities regardless of where they live. Continue using traditional IT ops while introducing DevOps practices to support new cloud and native patterns in your environment. Configure custom locations as an abstraction layer on top of your Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes clusters and cluster extensions. Currently, Azure Arc allows you to manage the following resources types hosted outside of Azure: servers, Kubernetes clusters, Azure Data Services, SQL Server, virtual machines. Preview. Azure Resource Manager (ARM). ARM is the deployment and management service for Azure. It provides a management layer that enables you to create, update, and delete resources in your Azure account. Anytime you do anything with your Azure resources, ARM is involved. When a user sends a request from any of the Azure Tools APIs or SDKs, ARM receives the request. ARM authenticates and authorizes the request. Then ARM sends the request to the Azure service, which takes the requested action. You see consistent results and capabilities in all the different tools because all requests are handled through the same API. Azure Resource Manager benefits. With Azure Resource Manager, you can manage your infrastructure through declarative templates rather than scripts. A resource manager template is a JSON file that defines what you want to deploy to Azure. Deploy, manage, and monitor all the resources for your solution as a group rather than handling these resources individually. Redeploy your solution throughout the deployment lifecycle and have confidence your resources are deployed in a consistent state. Define the dependencies between resources so they are deployed in the correct order. Apply access control to all services because RBAC is natively integrated into the management platform. Apply tags to resources to logically organize all the resources in your subscription. Clarify your organization's billing by viewing cost for a group of resources that share the same tag. ARM templates. Infrastructure as a code is a concept where you manage your infrastructure as lines of code. Leveraging Azure Cloud Shell, Azure PowerShell, or the Azure CLI are some examples of using code to deploy cloud infrastructure. ARM templates are another example of infrastructure as code at work. By using ARM templates, you can describe the resources you want to use in a declarative JSON format. With an ARM template, the deployment code is verified before any code is run. This ensures that the resources will be created and connected correctly. The template then orchestrates the sorting of those resources in parallel. That is, if you need 50 instances of the same resources, all 50 instances are created at the same time. Ultimately, the developer, DevOps professional, or IT professional needs only to define the desired state and configuration of each resource in the ARM template, and the template does the rest. Templates can even execute PowerShell and Bash scripts before or after the resource has been set up. Benefits of using ARM templates. ARM templates provide many benefits when planning for deploying Azure resources. Some of those benefits include declarative syntax. ARM templates allow you to create and deploy an entire Azure infrastructure declaratively. Declarative syntax means you declare what you want to deploy but don't need to write the actual programming commands and sequence to deploy the resources. Repeatable results. Repeatedly deploy your infrastructure throughout the development lifecycle and have confidence your resources are deployed in a consistent manner. You can use the same ARM template to deploy multiple dev test environments. knowing that all the environments are the same. Orchestration. You don't have to worry about the complexities of ordering of operations. Azure Resource Manager orchestrates the deployment of independent resources so they are created in the correct order. When possible, Azure Resource Manager deploys resources in parallel. So your deployments finish faster than serial deployments. You deploy the template through one command rather than through multiple imperative commands. Modular files. You can break your templates into smaller, reusable components and link them together at deployment time. You can also nest one template inside another template. For example, you could create a template for a VM stack and then nest that template inside of templates that deploy entire environments, and that VM stack will consistently be deployed in each of the environment templates. Extensibility. With development scripts, you can add PowerShell or Bash scripts to your templates. The deployment scripts extends your ability to set up resources during deployment. A script can include it in the template or stored in an external source and referenced in the template. Deployment scripts give you the ability to complete your end-to-end environment setup in a single ARM template. At the last stage of this tutorial, I want to review the tutorial in terms of the following topics. Azure Portal. The Azure Portal is a web-based unified console that provides an alternative to command line tools. With the Azure Portal, you can manage your Azure subscription by using a graphical user interface. Azure PowerShell. Azure PowerShell is a shell with which developers, DevOps, and IT professionals can run commands called commandlets, CMDlets. Azure Command Line Interface, CLI. The Azure CLI is functionally equivalent to Azure PowerShell, with the primary difference being the syntax of commands. While Azure PowerShell uses PowerShell commands and the Azure CLI uses Bash commands. Azure Arc. In utilizing Azure Resource Manager ARM, Arc lets you extend your Azure compliance and monitoring to your hybrid and multi-cloud configurations. Azure Resource Manager ARM. ARM is the deployment and management service for Azure. It provides a management layer that enables you to create, update, and delete resources in your Azure account. ARM templates. ARM templates provide many benefits when planning for deploying Azure resources, including declarative syntax, repeatable results, orchestration, and modular files. Thank you for watching this tutorial. I hope you all have been able to take the idea about the Azure resource management and deployment. If you think this tutorial is helpful for learning the Azure Cloud Computing, please click on the like button and request you all to share it more and more to the persons who are searching the tutorial like this. If you have any questions on this tutorial, opinions and queries about this channel, please type these in the comment box. You also mail to me. In the description box, email ID is given for you. Kindly subscribe to the channel and click on the bell button so that you can get notification when new tutorial is published.